going to cover is communications, and it'll kind of amplify a little bit on some of the things that we Chaz talked about earlier. But basically, how to use aircraft radio with emphasis on the CAP FM radio that's unique to CAP airplanes, as opposed to the radio which the pilot will normally use for air traffic control. We'll talk a little bit about the phonetic alphabet, but you're going to have to learn that on your own. It's not like we're going to go through a lesson to teach you that, but you can do an internet search for phonetic alphabet and learn to say Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, so forth like that. In CAP, when we're talking on CAP radios, we use what they call Prowords, which are words which have a very definite meaning, like over means a certain thing, out means another thing, and so forth. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, briefly mention that we don't really use any code words in CAP, other than sometimes there is a code word which the incident commander will put out. If somebody locates wreckage from a crash site, for example, they might use this one code word, and that will prevent the media, who monitors these frequencies, by the way, when we're doing something, from interfering with the conduct of the mission. The public affairs people will put out the word at the appropriate time, but we don't want word out early to the point where the media starts to interfere with the conduct of the mission. So we'll talk about reporting, where we're required to make mandatory reports periodically while we're flying on a CAP mission. We'll talk about some non-radio signaling, like using body positioning or a colored tarp, those kind of things. A little bit about working with ground teams. And briefly touch on airdrop. We don't really do much airdrop in CAP. It's prohibited except you are authorized to drop something out of an airplane if it can prevent or preserve human life, is about the only reason. So it has to be a pretty serious incident there. So let's talk about the comm equipment here. And Chaz did a good job of discussing a lot of the comm material, comm radios there. And we saw the radios in the G1000 aircraft. And I'm going to talk more about, like I said, this specific CAP FM radio there. The key on talking on radio, number one, is it's not that hard. You just need to say what you need to say in plain old English. We have some pro words like we talked about you can use, which kind of helps facilitate who gets to talk, who gets to listen. Our radios are, they're not duplex, they're single in that if one person's talking, the other person is listening, but you can't break in and talk at the same time. So one person talks, one person listens, and you alternate that back and forth. Simplex is what that term is for that, as opposed to duplex on a regular telephone, where even though somebody's talking, you can talk over them and they can hear you. So a picture of the G1000 aircraft, and you can see the radio panels are circled in red there, and we should get a better picture of them. But essentially, if you look at the radio there, there's two columns. There's a column buttons on the left, a column buttons on the right. The column of buttons on the left are your talk switches. They're going to be when you key the transmitter, and you do that by pressing a button on the yoke, that's the frequency or the radio you'll talk on. The row or the column of buttons on the right side, those are your listen switches. Those are the radios you want to listen to. So typically you'll be listening to more radios than you want to talk on. Usually you just talk on one radio, but you might listen on 2 or 3 different radios. And then in the lower right-hand corner, on the lower right-hand corner where you have a circle, that's the CAP FM radio. We'll have a better picture of that ahead here. Chaz talked about some of our older radios. That's really not applicable because we don't have those anymore, so we'll skip that. Okay, this is something that really kicks people's butts. Let me go back here. Along the very top, if you look where that green oval is, along the very top, there's a series of buttons you can see. Well, that's the intercom panel. And this is a graphic of what that intercom panel looks like. And the key, some big picture stuff, if you take a look at those push buttons, they're labeled like COM1, MKR, SPR. Those are all listen switches. Those are what you are allowed to listen on. So you can choose to listen on the number 1 COM radio if you press the COM1 key, or we have a second COM radio, COM2, you press that button, and that's what you listen on. And then on the right-hand side, there's a knob. Currently, that knob has an index which is pointing to COM1. But that knob could also be rotated. It has click stops in it to COM2 or COM3. That's the radio you're going to transmit on. And whether you're in the front seat or the back seat, if you select COM1 on that rotary knob and you key the mic button on the yoke, you will transmit on that COM1 radio. Now, one thing they've done is they've decided if you're going to transmit on the COM1 radio, so you have that rotary knob, the talk switch on COM1, it will automatically put the listen switch on COM1 also, because you want to listen before you talk. You don't want to just, if somebody else might be talking on the frequency, you don't want to talk over them. So whatever you select on that rotary knob, as far as COM1, 2, or 3, the appropriate listen switch will light up, and so you'll listen on that. Now, if you look on that talk knob, the one on the right, you'll see on the right-hand selection, if you turn that knob clockwise, it says COM1/2, COM1/3, or COM2/3. So what this knob allows you to do is to split the intercom and split the radios in the cockpit. And when you turn it to the right to one of these double positions, like 1/2, 2/3, now the intercom, which allowed you to talk back and forth to the pilot, will isolate. And so you won't be able to hear or talk to the pilot anymore. And the pilot will be on whatever radio is the first digit in that label. So if you were to move it one click to the right, you'd stop talking to the pilot on the intercom. And let me mention that the intercom is duplex. The intercom is like a telephone. You can talk and hear each other simultaneously. So if you go to COM1/2, the pilot now, when he keys his mic button on the yoke, presses the button to talk, he'll talk on the COM1 radio. If you, in the right seat, press to talk switch, you will talk on COM2, which is the second FAA radio, if you will. Typically, what you will do as a scanner, though, if you're in the front right seat, is you'll want to talk on the CAP radio. And the CAP FM radio is radio 3. So if the pilot asks you to call the mission base, you'll say, okay, I'm off. And you'll take that knob and you'll rotate it to COM1/3. And now the pilot will still be able to talk on COM1 if that's what he was on. And you will be able to talk on COM3. The other option, if you went to 1, 2, if you went 3 clicks clockwise, you would be on COM2/3. And that means the pilot would be talking on COM2 all by his lonesome on his own intercom, and you'd be isolated on your intercom talking on radio 3. So you need to be aware of which radio the pilot was on before you go over to use COM3. So again, on the left of vertical, COM1 position on that knob, on the talk knob, COM2 or COM3 is for both the observer, the scanner, the right seat occupant, and the left seat occupant. When you go to the right of vertical, now you split it. And again, when you're on the left, you're on duplex on intercom. When you're on the right, you're on isolate on intercom. That's called the split mode. The swap mode down there, we don't really have, so I'm not going to get into that. They haven't wired that up. The intercom mode, if you'll take a look refer to the left side of the diagram now, you see intercom volume, a knob, volume knob, it's labeled volume there. And right next to it is a wee little toggle switch. It's a 3-position switch, and it's labeled intercom mode select. And there are 3 positions. The upper position, it's a little hard to read. Let's see if I can zoom that in. The upper position is ISO. And the way that works is if you select ISO, the pilot disconnects himself from everybody else in the airplane as far as talking on the intercoms on our headsets. So if he wants to talk on the radio and other people are yucking it up in the back, or the scanner's talking on the number 3 radio, and he wants to get rid of all that stuff, he goes to ISO. The middle position is labeled all. I think you may be able to see that there. And that is, that lets everybody in the airplane, all 4 occupants, talk on a party line to each other over their headsets. And then the bottom position of that little toggle switch is crew. What that does is splits the intercom. The 2 backseaters can talk to each other, but nobody else. And the 2 front seaters can talk to each other and nobody else. So normally we just run it in all, and everybody gets along. But some people will choose one of those other positions. And if you ever get in the airplane and it looks like for some reason the intercom isn't working right, some people can talk, some people can't. 9 times out of 10, it's because that switch is mispositioned. So take a look at that switch. It's kind of innocuous, but it's important. Also, the intercom, the whole intercom itself, the whole intercom system can be turned on and off, and that's with that volume knob. And I believe some of them vary. Some of them you turn all the way counterclockwise and it clicks, just like maybe your car radio. And some of them you push in to turn the power on, and then you push it to turn it off. So again, if the intercom isn't working, check that volume knob, push on it, turn it, and see if you can't get it going. Chances are that'll be the key. So the bottom line is those square buttons that all label, those are all listen switches. That's what you listen to. And then the round knob on the right, that's your talk switch. That's what you talk on. As far as labeling those listen switches from left to right, on the top row is COM1. That's COM1 radio. NAV1 is the navigation radio. They put out Morse code signals so you can verify you're tuned into the correct station. MKR is marker, that has to do with the instrument landing system. ADF, that has to do with our Becker direction finding equipment and being able to listen over that 4th radio we have in the airplane, which allows us to home in on locator transmitters. DME, we don't have in the airplanes anymore. It's been replaced by GPS. So now if you look at the bottom row, COM2 is the 2nd FAA radio, NAV2 is 2nd navigation radio. ICS is the intercom. So normally you'll have that pressed on so that people can talk to each other in the intercom. COM3, you always want to be monitoring COM3 because COM3 you're going to put to you're going to tune that radio to a frequency where mission base can get a hold of you. Or maybe if mission base is too far away, you would have a hybrid, an airplane that's orbiting up at high altitude that you could talk to. So you always want to have that COM3 button depressed And you see those little green dots? Those green dots light up. They're light bulbs. And so when the button is pressed, the green light lights. When you press the button again, the green light turns off. So that's how you know whether it's actuated or not. So we always want to monitor COM3 in case the mission base wants to give us some new directions or direct us to return to base or retask us, those kind of things. And then SPR, it stands for speaker. And so there's a speaker built into the ceiling and the airplane, and you can press that button to turn that speaker on and off. This is something you're going to get your hands dirty with, so you need to understand how it works. Basically, this page summarizes what I talked about. So it should be fairly clear, I think. If you needed to look at what a certain mode, certain selection of the switches does, this would tell you. Like, for example, under the mic selector, the talk switch, if you go over to COM3, then you'll be talking on COM3 on both the pilot and the co-pilot. But if you go to COM2/3, just like I talked about, the pilot will be talking on COM2 and the co-pilot or the right seater on COM3. Disregard the swap. The swap is a feature which we have not enabled in our airplanes. And then the bottom, the intercom modes, again, isolate, I talked about, all and crew. Normally we run in all. That way everybody, if they have anything important to say, can say it. We're going to skip that. We don't have that anymore. These are what the antennas look like on the top of the airplane. More than anything else, that just shows you where the antennas are located, because one of the methods we use for direction finding is the wing null method. And we'll actually bank the airplane up so that the wing blocks the radio signals coming to that antenna. And by noting what direction the wing was when a signal gets blanked, that helps us find out where the signal's coming from. And we can actually use that to home in on a emergency locator transmitter. Well, there's the CAP FM radio. And yeah, I got a better picture of it there. So yeah, obviously we don't use the radio for yucking around. We use it for official business only. But some people that are new to radio communications sometimes have what they call mic fright, where they're reluctant to talk on the radio and get all nervous and sweaty hands and all that kind of stuff. So just don't worry about it though. That it's just like talking on the phone, except it's simplex instead of duplex. And instead of dialing a number, we just go to a certain frequency, and that's how that works. It talks about, I think in the second from the bottom bullet, follow the comm plan. Part of the comm plan is there be various repeaters, like in Hawaii, we have several different repeaters that allow radios to cover a longer distance than they would just with a line of sight. For example, here on Maui, if I'm looking from where I am to the southeast, Haleakala would block that line of sight. Fortunately, though, and so I wouldn't be able to get a signal from here over to the southeast part of the island there, down towards Kihei or Big Beach. But unfortunately, we have a repeater that's located at the top of Haleakala, and all my radio has to do is reach that repeater, and then that repeater retransmits that signal. And so somebody in Kihei or Big Beach would still be able to hear me. So that's what we're talking about there. Okay, so here's the FM radio. Let's talk about the controls on it. Let's start with below the display. There's a knob on the left that's labeled main. I wish I had a cursor, so I'll just have to explain it. So it's labeled main. Notice if you turn that knob so the index is all the way to off, it turns off the radio. That's the power for the radio. Anytime this radio is way smarter than I am. It has a tremendous capability to do all kinds of fancy stuff. Well, we use it very simply and watered down in CAP. But it's very easy if you hit the wrong button to get it into some mode you have no idea. It's off in La La Land somewhere. So don't panic. All you got to do is turn the thing off. So turn that knob all the way to the off position. Wait a couple seconds. and then turn it back, and you can turn it where that index is pointing straight up, is kind of an average volume setting. So that's the volume for the main radio. And actually this radio has two radios inside, two receivers. It has the main radio, and then the second one, if you look off to your right, is labeled guard. And so that radio will be monitored in the background. And if somebody transmits on that guard frequency, then you'll hear the transmission from that station there. And in fact, you can choose between two guard frequencies. And if you look underneath the knob labeled guard, there's a toggle switch labeled G1, G2. So G1 is guard 1, G2 is guard 2. So there should be a comm plan which would tell you what settings should be for that switch. Typically, we fly in guard 1. To the left of that, right underneath the main volume knob, is a toggle switch labeled MN and GD. MN is main. That's basically what you're going to transmit on. And if you flip that switch down to guard, now you'll be transmitting on the guard frequency. Which guard frequency? Whichever one you have selected in the toggle switch to the right, G1, G2. Okay, moving along. If you look on the top row, you see main, guard, and then you see squelch. Well, what's a squelch? If you tune into a radio station and there's nothing being transmitted, you'll still hear something on the radio. You'll hear static. And if you did that on your car radio, for example, tune it to a frequency where there's no transmitter, you'll hear all that hissing and static and pops and so forth. Well, they have a circuit called the squelch, because that's annoying to listen to and actually becomes fatiguing after a while. They have a circuit called the squelch, which will turn that off. And then if somebody talks on that radio and there's some intelligence coming across, then it automatically turns your speaker on and you can hear it. Sometimes, and in this airplane, it's not adjustable. It's an automatic squelch. And it works pretty good. But sometimes if there's a real weak signal, or if you want to adjust your volume because you don't know exactly where that needs to be, you can depress that squelch button. When you push that button in, it's a push button, that disables the squelch, lets you hear the background static on a real weak station, or allows you to adjust the volume control. And it probably takes two hands. One hand to hold the squelch button in, typically your right hand with your forefinger, and then use your left hand to adjust the volume. High-low switch there, that's your high power, low power. We just brute force and put in high normally. There might be some times where if you're operating close to a repeater or close to somebody on the ground, you might overwhelm their receiver and you'll come in very distorted. So if that's the case, one of the things you can do to try to solve that is go to low. So now moving over to the keypad. You see there's a bunch of keys there, but you see there's 4 of the keys that have an arrow on them. Okay, here's the story. Those are the only keys you ever touch, period. If it doesn't have an arrow on it, you don't touch it, and that'll keep you out of trouble. So what do these arrow keys do? Well, I'll start with the easy one. The 2 up arrow and the 8 down arrow, that adjusts the brightness of the display. And so at night, if this thing is real bright, like it's been set for day, and then you're flying at night, it might be very dim. And so you would hit the 2 button, and that would increase the intensity of the display. And vice versa, if you get in the day and you don't see anything in that display, well, it could be the last person who flew at night and they dimmed it way down. And so you'll have to adjust it up. And I think I might have misspoke. If you're flying at night, you would dim it by hitting the 8 button. I think I misspoke on that. So that's all those buttons do. That's all you have to worry about on that. The only other buttons you ever touch are the 4 and the 6, the left arrow and the right key. And what those 2 arrows do is change the frequency that you're on, or the channel. And you notice in the upper left-hand corner, it says 001. Well, that's the channel that you're on. You're on channel 1. And so these things are all channelized, and they got numbers in it. And the different repeaters have different channel allocations in the Hawaii wing. Notice where to the left is 001. On the upper row in the display, it says main. That will say whatever repeater you're on here, if you're on a repeater, or it might be another frequency like Air 1, Air 2, those kind of things. So that would tell you, if you don't know what the channel number is, you can just hit these arrow keys left and right until the name of the repeater is the one you want to be on. So what repeater do you want to be on? Well, if you're flying around Maui, the Maui repeater would be a good idea. On the other hand, though, if you're flying around Maui and you want to talk to somebody at Hilo, well, then maybe the Hilo repeater would be a good one, assuming you have line of sight. These radios only work with a direct line of sight. So that might be the case. Or if you're inbound to Honolulu, even though you're still here on Maui, up at altitude, you can hit the Honolulu repeater and let them know that you're inbound, particularly if that's the mission base, for example. So again, you only press the buttons with the arrow on it. Up and down is display intensity, left and right is channel. Okay, faster and funnier. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, what they're talking about is on the third bullet there, putting guard 1. And if guard 1 frequency is programmed in there is the mission base, then even though you might be talking on a different radio or just be listening on a different radio, if the mission base wants to get a hold of you, they could transmit on guard 1, and that would come through. And then you would flip that left toggle switch down to GD to guard, and then you'd be talking on guard 1. Okay, so radio-wise, again, the pilot will take care of the FAA radios, but typically the right seater is going to work the CAP radios. So on the CAP radio, first of all, before we launch, we want to make sure it works. So on the ground, once we get the engine started and we have a avionics master switch that turns off all the avionics until we get the generators on the line, get the engine started, everything's cool electrically wise. Then we turn on the avionics master switch. That puts power to the radios. You let this radio warm up for about 30 seconds. It goes through some self bits, and the display will show a bunch of stuff which we don't really care about. And then once you get it going, you would want to tune in to whatever frequency the mission base is on, whether it be one of the repeaters or maybe a direct frequency, and get a radio check. And so how would you do that? Well, you would say something like Maui mission base Capt 3-4 radio check. And they would come back Capt 3-4, Maui mission base, you are loud and clear, or you are weak but readable, or they may not answer at all, which you need to figure out is it their radio or your radio. So we want to do a pre-taxi radio check, make sure it's working. And then one of the objectives for this particular module is the minimum required reports. So let's talk about that. In order for the leadership at the mission base, the incident commander, to be aware of where his resources are, he requires a certain number of required reports. The first one is a wheels up report. So whenever you get airborne, you note what that time is. You want to wait until we're out of the sterile cockpit environment, which is normally defined as within 1,000 feet of the runway. So wait until we're at least 1,000 feet above the runway, and then ask the pilot if you can go off to make the wheels up call. And so you would do that, you would rotate, and if the pilot was talking on COM 2 because COM 1 was bad, let me ask you this. If the pilot was talking on COM 2, because COM 1 is bad, and he directed you to go off and report wheels up, where would you turn that talk knob on the intercom panel? Where would that be switched to?
2/3?
2/3, that's right. You go to 2/3, the pilot will continue talking on 2, and you'll be talking on 3. Perfect. So wheels up time, and then we're required every half hour to check in, and that's just to make sure, that's a safety thing, you know, make sure that you haven't run off the face of the earth somewhere, had a mishap, landed, crashed, whatever. So every half hour we make a ops normal report, and that half hour is based on the wheels up time. So that's why you want to write down what that wheels up time is, and then as a crew work together, try to remember to make your ops normal reports. And so you're going to be When you report ops normal, you're going to be doing a check on your airplane, that fuel selector valve that Chaz talked about, fuel state, engine instrument, so forth. You also want to do a position report. And so you would say something like Capt 3-4, ops normal at 3-5 past the hour over Little Beach, something like that. And then normally you would get acknowledged either by the mission base or by a hybrid. It may be that nobody is in radio range that you know of, they don't respond. You still make the call in the blind. It's called where you make the call even though nobody answers there. And then the next one down, we'll call in the search area or in the grid, depending on what kind of a search pattern you're going to be used. We'll be talking about those on Wednesday. So when you're doing your searching, you call in the grid. You still remember every anniversary, every 30 minutes, you still have to make your ops normal calls. And then when you're exiting the search area, you use the ProWord RTB. RTB stands for Return to Base. So Capt 3-4 RTB. And then finally, when you land, you're going to call the mission base after you've cleared the runway and report wheels down at such a time. So those are your required reports. So this is typically how you will see the radio installed on the right instrument panel to the right and below the yoke typically. So the radio we just talked about, that's COM3. And then above it, you see a display there. And that is our Becker direction finding equipment that allows us to home in on these emergency locator transmitters. That is something that you as an observer will learn how to use, but not as a scanner typically. I will mention though, on below the radio, you see some circuit breakers. And then on the left-hand side, there is a mission master switch. So prior to starting the engine, we want to make sure that the mission master switch is in the off position, down position. Once the engine is started and the pilot has turned on the avionics master switch, that's that one that controls all the radios, well, all the radios, well then that switch will now give power to the mission master. The mission master switch controls power to the CP-FM radio and to the Becker. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see aft accessory outlet. We have a power outlet if you have a laptop or a iPad or something. In the back of the airplane, there's a 12-volt power outlet there, just a cigarette lighter kind of thing that you can power your equipment back there. Okay, so using the radio, what do you want to do? First of all, you want to make sure you're on the proper frequency. Otherwise, you're not going to get who you want to talk to. So that's a talk switch I talked about as far as which radio you're going to talk on, and then the correct frequency on that radio. Think before you talk. Our call sign in airplanes is Cap. In the whole rest of the Civil Air Patrol, it's going to be a 2-digit number like 46 or 47, which applies to your wing, tells them what wing you are. And then the last 2 digits tell you what airplane it is. Here, we don't have to worry about getting mixed up about which wing we're in because we're a long ways from the nearest one. It's 2,500 miles. So we just use the 2 digits. The 2 digits do not correspond to a tail number. They're just arbitrary call sign assignments that each airplane will have. There'll be a placard on the instrument panel somewhere. It will be labeled CAP and then the 2 digits, like 34 or 21 or whatever it might be. It may be labeled CAPF because we used to use a slightly different call sign, but in any case, the number will still be correct. You want to listen before you talk, so you don't talk over somebody. Select the desired talk switch, and then if you're talking on a repeater, you want to push the talk button. There's a button on the yoke that you press to talk. You need to wait a second or two for the repeater to turn on and turn on the receiver and its transmitter, and then go ahead and talk. So press the button, count to 1 or 2, and then talk clearly and slowly. And then when you get done, come off. Now, if somebody talks to you, it's the same thing. If they talk to you on the radio, when they stop talking, give them a second to let go of that mic button and to get their radio back in the proper configuration before you key your mic and start talking. If you get on the mic the second that they get off the mic, they're not going to hear the first part of your transmission. So it's a little bit more slow and deliberate, but you'll get used to it very fast. So they're talking about different frequencies, and these are all on the FAA radio. Typically, your mission pilot will worry about that, so you don't have to worry about that too much. There should be a comm plan, particularly for a large exercise or a large effort, and so you'll pick a copy of that comm plan up when you leave the briefing. If you're a remote op, though, you may not have a comm plan, or they may email the comm plan to you. So you might have to ask, okay, which radio is mission base going to be on, for example. One thing about comm discipline is when we're talking on radios, we normally don't use our names at all. So it's all call signs. And by the way, I mentioned the airplane call sign is Capt and then whatever. In Hawaii Wing, the ground stations will normally use Firebrand and then a number. So my ground call sign, for example, is Firebrand 5704. However, and that's for day-to-day peacetime use. When we go to a exercise or a mission, and you have a mission base, then you use functional call signs. So instead of Firebrand, whatever their call sign used to be, it's now Maui Mission Base or Hilo Mission Base. And that way it's very clear who you're talking to. You don't have to remember a number or anything special like that.
Colonel, I have a question. This is Chad. Regarding the time for ops calls, it was wheels up immediately after wheels up report immediately after you're at 1,000 feet. And whatever time that happens to be, the next call would be 30 minutes after that time, or is it the top and bottom of the hour thing? So you'd call wheels up at quarter after, and then you'd do another report at half past the hour, and the next one at top of the hour, or is it, depending on your aircraft, your calls are initial and subsequent are going to be based on your wheels up time, and everybody else might be different? Which is the right procedure?
Yes. And the reason I say that is different wings have different conventions on that. In a Hawaii wing, they have chosen to base the half-hour reports, optional reports on your wheels up time. Not the time you make the wheels up call, but the actual wheels up time that you call in.
Okay.
And so it's a little tricky because if you take off at 7 minutes past the hour, well, then at 37 minutes and then at 7 minutes and so forth, you're going to make those calls. Other wings use the top and bottom of the hour. The reason we don't in Hawaii wing, what I've heard at least, is that it prevents everybody from trying to make calls all at once. And we only have 10 airplanes in the whole wing, and at any one time, maybe 3 of them are operational, the way it's been lately. So I don't think that's such a big factor. However, the convention in Hawaii wing, to answer your question, is based on your wheels up time. But that's something you need to ascertain, and that's a real good question, and particularly if you're augmenting another wing somewhere, you would want to ask, what is your convention on the ops normal call?
Okay, it's also part of would that be part of the pre-mission briefing, the ops plan or the comm plan?
Yeah.
And would it be published at that?
That should be in the comm plan for sure. But if it's not for some reason, then you'd want to ask.
And that's something else that, as a scanner, since you're keeping a log, would the scanner or the observer be the one responsible for the comm log?
We're not really required to maintain a comm log in the airplane. We have to maintain a comm log at a base station, but in airplanes you're relieved from that. So the scanner is going to keep a mission log, significant milestones in the mission, but the observer or the front right seater would not have to keep a separate comm log.
Who's going to keep track of, we were wheels up at 13 after the hour, and so you make your call then, because you're at 1,000 feet, and then 30 minutes later, it would be 43 minutes after the hour, and you need to know what your start time of that clock was. That's what I'm trying to get to. Who's responsible for keeping that?
The person that keeps that that log is the scanner, and the scanner would prompt the whoever's the scanner may be in the right seat himself. Who knows? But if he's not, then he would prompt the guy in the right seat and he'd make a ops normal call. Notice on the bullet under Capt there, fourth bullet down, Cap 448, rescue. We are authorized to use this rescue suffix if we deem it necessary because of saving somebody's life, life-saving type event. We can use rescue, and that will give us priority for ATC handling. So if you're trying to go somewhere and they're vectoring you elsewhere, and you need to put your destination on the nose and pedal fast, you can use that term rescue. We would never use that in a training environment ever. It would only be real world, and it would only be to save life or limb. Okay, so this stuff, I'm just going to expose you to it. They're talking about how to pronounce the different numbers. When you're talking on a radio, sometimes things can sound similar. For example, 2 and 3 can sound very similar. And so they emphasize using different sounding words that won't be mistaken. So for the number 2, like in dose, would be 2. Instead of saying 3, you say tree. Instead of 9, it's niner. So those are some examples of how you say the numbers there. 10 is, instead of saying 10, you might, particularly if the radio reception was poor, you might say 10. If you download on the internet, a phonetic alphabet, it'll have both the letters, like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and it will have the numbers as well. And here's the letters just for your reference. Okay, we talked about pro words earlier. They're not code words. They're words that have very specific definition. And so there's a list of pro words there. This is where it would pay you to take a look at CAP regulation 100-1. And there will be, I believe in the back, an appendix that talks about some of the pro words. Words that people get confused sometimes are over and out. When you say over, what you mean is that you're done talking and the other person on the line, it's their turn to start talking. So when you say over, you do expect a response back. On the other hand, if you're done with a conversation, you terminate that conversation by saying out. So you wouldn't say over and out, you would just say out. So Cap 3-4 out when you're done, and you may even change frequencies. Over doesn't mean that you, all it means is that the line is open, you can talk now. So there's the term Roger and Wilco. When you say Roger, what you're saying is you understand what somebody said. So if somebody tells you that you are supposed to return at 10 o'clock, return to base at 10 o'clock, Roger means you understand it. Wilco means you're going to comply. So if the base says that you are to return at 10 o'clock and the pilot's nodding his head, well, then you answer Wilco. Wilco means you understood what you said and I will comply. That's what Wilco stands for. It's a abbreviation, contraction. If you just want to indicate you understood it, but you're not going to necessarily comply, you're not going to do it, then you say Roger. So those 4 words are ones that you should probably understand. The other word that's useful is break. So if 2 people are talking and you want to get in the conversation, well, you don't just pipe in and start talking. That would be rude. So what you do is when one of them stops talking real quickly, you key your mic and you say break. And then you wait for one of the 2 parties who is already in the conversation to acknowledge the break. And maybe they won't acknowledge it right away because they've got something important to say. So that's fine. You just sit there quietly and wait for them to acknowledge it. After a reasonable time where they come back and forth 3 or 4 times, if they haven't acknowledged your break, then you would say break again. You would repeat it. And that's if you want to break into the conversation. maybe you have something to add, or maybe you need their help. Affirmative is another word for yes, negative is no. If you say something and you want to make sure that they've got it exactly right, for example, you give them coordinates of a possible sighting. Well, you would give them the coordinates, and then after you give them the coordinates, you would use the term or the pro word readback. And that way you would expect them to read back those coordinates to you so you can ensure that they were correct. There's a light gun in most air traffic control towers. So if for some reason your radio will become inoperative, the tower can signal various things to you by shining this very bright spotlight at you. And it has different colors. It has 3 colors: green, red, or white. And by either flashing or showing a steady color, that can tell you various things. I've had a couple times where my radio is out. I've looked for these lights. I've never in my career seen the light. However, I call the tower afterwards and say, yeah, we shined the light at you and stuff. So these lights are not as bright as they could be, or maybe I'm not as bright as I could be, but I've never seen them. Anyway, if your radio were to, the FAA radio were to go out, the pilot might ask you to observe the tower and look for light signals. So that's what you'd be looking for. If you're overflying somebody on the ground, they can use various body signals. This normally, the layman wouldn't be familiar with what these body signals are, but a CAP ground team would, or a CAP crew would. And so they can use these body signals. And the way I handle this, I don't memorize these because I very infrequently use them. But I have a notebook which I carry with me when I fly. And in that notebook, it's kind of like a checklist. I've got these body signals in there, as well as these pollen signals. What's a pollen? A pollen is a tarpaulin, so it's an abbreviation for a tarpaulin. It is yellow on one side and blue on the other side. By folding in various corners, it's like origami almost, by folding in different corners and different parts of that tarp, you can make all these different signals there. Arrows and first aid, need medical supplies, need gas and oil. This is something that, again, it's unlikely, but it's possible you might see a signal. So if you did see a tarp like that, you'd pull out your book, your reference book, and go from there. So you can do a search on the internet for pollens signals. Notice the spelling on it. It's not like P-O-L-L-E-N, but P-A-U-L-I-N. And there's another set of signals which are international, ICAO signals. And these are these emergency distress signals. And typically people would use like large logs on a beach, maybe to form these different symbols, possibly strips of some kind of material, something that would be bright. So again, I don't propose to memorize any of these. I just have them for reference when I fly. Talking briefly about air-to-ground coordination, just a couple of salient points on that. They're talking about who's primary, the airplane or the ground team. And depending on the terrain, availability of resources and stuff, it could be one or the other. If the weather's bad, the planes might not be flying or might have difficulty operating. So the ground would be primary, the ground teams. On the other hand, on a clear day with lots of air resources, then aircraft would. What they're talking about, though, is if you have a primary search area, you can pre-position ground teams in that area. They'll be on standby because it takes a while in a vehicle to get to someplace. And then the airplane would be the primary search resource. And if they did spot something, by having the ground teams pre-positioned, you could have a much faster response. And conversely, if you go the other way around, where the ground teams are primary, airplanes, we're zipping along at 130, 140 miles an hour. So we can get places a lot faster. So normally the aircraft would be staged at an airport, typically the mission base, but not necessarily. Could be a remote airport on the ground, and then they would respond to a request for air assistance by the ground team. What's important if you're assigned to work with a ground team is to coordinate with them face-to-face on the ground. It's really awkward for the ground team to go off, do its thing, airplane take off, and then people who never met each other, have no idea what's going on, trying to communicate back and forth. If you're going to work with a ground team, it's important to pre-brief with them on the ground, talk about which maps you're going to be using, so there's no confusion there. Talk about the convention for latitude and longitude. Sometimes the ground team might have a handheld GPS that uses degrees, minutes, and seconds. And if you're giving them GPS coordinates in degrees, minutes, and tenths of a minute, there's room for confusion there. And 1 minute of latitude is 1 nautical mile, which is about 1.15 statute miles. So that can be significant. Yeah, and also when you brief with a ground team, you want to talk about what frequencies you're going to be on, because it's the pits. When you're talking on one radio, they got that same radio talking on a different frequency, and you can't talk to each other. Primarily now we got GPS in both assets, so we can use GPS coordinates, but also you can pass information from the airplane by stating, you know, go up to the intersection, turn right at the next intersection, turn left on the dirt road, that kind of stuff. They talk about the Thomas guides or the gazetteers. And I don't know if we have any in Hawaii or not. Have you guys seen any of those things, those maps, like I was showing in the bottom of that picture there?
Ed, I have some old topographic maps, and it used to be, I can't remember the company that did the Atlas maps, kind of like the California one that's illustrated there. Mm-hmm. But I haven't seen one for Maui for years, or for Hawaii at all.
Yeah, there's a real common on the mainland there. You know, I've got one that covers all of Washington State. And when you're working with a ground team, sometimes you need a lot more detail than our aeronautical charts will have. And so those are the kind of things you want to coordinate, you know. And ideally, you'll have the same map in both assets, both in the airplane and the ground team. Rendezvous points. Bill's gas station at the corner of I-15 and Highway 66. That's pretty self-explanatory. Ideally, a ground team vehicle will have a number painted on the top. That helps. There are some signals you can use if you don't have radio contact for whatever reason, and you're working with a ground team. If you want them to turn around, for example, in the upper left corner, you would overfly the ground team in the direction that they're driving, and then make a rapid turn back the opposite direction. And that's a hint to them to turn around. Or if you want them to make a turn in a certain direction, in the lower left corner, they show you that. If there's a point of interest, what you do is just sit there and orbit that point. Hopefully they can see you from wherever they are, and they'll just work their way in to try to get right underneath you. Rocking your wings, we all know what rocking your wings means. It means you received a message and it's understood. If you just keep circling, that could be confusing. That could be identifying a target location, or it means you didn't understand what was being said. Yes, you pump the nose up and down, like nodding. No, you move the nose left and right, just like shaking your head.